Hey everyone, thanks for joining this webinar about financial literacy and finances for living on your own after graduation. We're excited to have Donna Drummond here joining us, and I'll have her introduce herself and we will get started on this workshop. Go ahead, Donna.
Oh, you want to start with me?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Donna Drummond, and I'm the Market Development Coordinator for Robbins Financial Credit Union. And a big part of what I do is financial literacy within the community. So I appreciate y'all having me with you today.
Oops. Oh no. Awesome. Thank you. Sorry. Let me pull up that video. Oh no. Sorry, y'all. I was having some tech issues. Let me reshare my screen. And there we go. Alrighty, so here's our quick video to kick us off.
And I was like, well, you have a birthday party every single year. Of course, my hypothetical housewarming party would be priority.
Yeah, sure.
Hold up. What is this?
Oh, I've seen this before. Actually, Jen, since you're thinking of getting your own place, you should probably play it.
What do you do?
Well, common apartment expenses pop up here, and you pay them by whacking them with this mallet.
That sounds awesome. I'm so ready.
We'll see. It starts off pretty easy with rent.
Piece of cake.
But you have to keep track of utilities and things like cable and internet too.
I get it. Regular budget stuff. This is so easy.
Good, because this is still the practice mode. The actual moving into an apartment mode starts now.
Ah, what is all this stuff?
There's your security deposit and first and last month's rent, since some landlords ask for that. Sometimes a credit or background check is required, and you need to pay for those too. There's a pet deposit, and you can't forget that parking stalls sometimes have an extra fee. Then there's association fees for certain apartment buildings. Oh, and renter's insurance. And that's not counting moving expenses.
Uh-oh.
Moving companies or truck rental or a pizza budget for friends helping out, packing materials like boxes and tape, and the bare necessities of apartment setup like toilet paper, light bulbs, cleaning supplies, utensils, a first aid kit, a tool kit, and we haven't even gotten to furniture yet.
Futon! How did I do?
Well, you missed your pet deposit and your electricity bill, so you'd be living in the dark and you wouldn't have your cat. And judging by your score, it looks like you need to have a lot more than just a couple months' rent saved up before you make the move.
Why is it doing that?
It's a new month, so some of the expenses from that last round are going to pop up again.
So when does this game actually end?
Oh, Jen, it never ends.
All right, can you all see this presentation on your screen? All right, awesome.
Okay, so we're ready? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. All right, so we're ready now?
Yep, all ready. Thank you.
If y'all hear noise in the background, I apologize. Outside my window, they're apparently blowing leaves or something. Hopefully that's not going to be too distracting. But what we're going to talk about today is living on your own, and basically, specifically what we're looking at is how much money you need to have put aside before you move out on your own, because it's not just a matter of having your first month's rent. There's a whole lot more to it than that. So we're going to take a look at some of your basic expenses that you need to have put aside before you make that move. Okay, there are a number of things you need to consider when you start making this plan. Next slide, please, ma'am. The first thing, and one of the most important things that you need to do before you move out, is to build a budget. If you don't have a budget in place, you don't really have any idea about what you can afford, how much rent you can afford, what your expenses are going to be. So you need to build your budget before you start the next step of getting ready to move out, like looking for a place. Anybody know what a budget is? Exactly what the definition of a budget is? It's basically a plan of how you're going to spend your money, where your money's going to go. And when you build a budget, you need to give every dollar that you have coming in a job so that you can account for every dollar that's going out. Even if you just assign a job like going into your savings account or Mad Money or going out to eat money. But if you can account for every dollar and give it a job, then you know exactly how much you can afford, where your money's going, how much you have coming in versus how much you've got going out. Okay, next slide. This is a screen of some basic spending ratios. These are guidelines. They don't have to be exactly these numbers, but it's a good guideline to get you started. And basically what a spending ratio is a reflection of how much of your budget you should allot to each one of these items. In other words, 30% is for housing. You don't want to have more than 30% of your income or your monthly budget going to housing. If you're spending more than 30% of your monthly budget on housing, then you're probably in an apartment that you can't really afford. So that's what your spending ratio is, just guidelines of how much of your budget needs to go to each one of these allocations. So of course, when we look at this, the largest one is of course housing. What do y'all think falls under the housing allocation? And y'all can just speak up.
Gas, utilities, things like that.
What do you think is the biggest part of your housing?
Rent.
Rent, exactly.
Yeah.
Almost everyone starts out on their own renting because it takes a while to build up down payments, to build up your credit in order to be able to afford to buy a place. So everybody starts out renting. But rent is going to be the biggest part of that housing allocation. And we're going to take a look at some of the average rents around the country in just a few minutes. But there are other things that fall up under that as well. But the biggest part is rent. Now, the next two largest parts of these spending ratios, the first one is food. So of course, groceries fall under food, right? But what else do you think falls under the food allocation? Not just going to the grocery store, what else?
Like eating out?
Eating out, that is a big one because you can budget for groceries and you can pretty much control what you spend at the grocery store. But a lot of times people forget to include what they spend going out to eat. And yes, you can go to McDonald's and spend $5 and get a Happy Meal or, eat pretty inexpensively. But if you do that 2 or 3 times a week, let's say you get a $5 Happy Meal 3 times a week, that's $15. And if you do that 4 weeks out of the month, 15 times 4 is $60. When you add it all up, that's a pretty big chunk of your food budget right there. And it's not just going through the drive-thru or eating out. Think about how many times you go get a coffee, a Starbucks, or while you're pumping gas, you run inside the convenience store and you grab a drink and a snack. Or if you're at school and you walk past the vending machine and you grab a drink or a snack or both. If you think about it, those drinks are what, $1.25, $1.50, sometimes more. You get a snack, that's going to be at least another $1. So if you're spending $2.50 every time you grab a snack, and you grab a snack 5 days a week at the vending machine, that is what is that? 25 times 5 is what? Was that $15 a week? Times 4 weeks, that's $60 a month just on junk, just on snacks. But because it doesn't cost so much at the time, we tend to forget about it or not really think about it. We think, yeah, it's just a couple dollars. But if you do it on a regular basis, it starts to add up. So when you're looking at creating your food budget, you need to include groceries, going out to eat, any kind of specialty drinks or coffees, and any snacks that you get just when you're in a hurry from the vending machine or the convenience store, because it all adds up. Now, another allocation that's equally important, another 15%, is transportation. What do y'all think falls under that heading?
Gas.
Gas, if you own a car. If you're living downtown and you take the bus or you take Uber, then instead of a car, instead of gas, then you would include that transportation cost. What if you're living in an apartment complex where you have to pay for a parking garage? That falls under transportation, that monthly expense. So anything that falls under either gas or maintenance of your car or anything that gets you from point A to point B, that falls under your transportation allocation. And you should not be spending more than 15% of your whole budget every month on transportation expenses. Now, the next two that are each 10%. The first one is leisure. And this is always fun. What do you think falls under leisure activities?
Going to the movies.
Going to movies, renting movies, anything that you do, going to plays, going to concerts, anything that you do for fun that costs money, that falls under your leisure budget allowance. And you should not be spending more than 10% of your monthly budget every month on leisure activities. If what you're spending is more than 10%, then you're spending too much. And after this, we're gonna show you how to get to these percentages, how to figure it out. Another 10% of your budget is for personal. What do you think falls under personal items?
Makeup.
Makeup, definitely. I don't know about y'all, but every 5 weeks I have to get my hair done.
Like if you have pets, you have to spend for them.
That could fall under personal, yes. What about getting your hair cut, getting your hair colored? What about getting your nails done? Or going to get a facial, or even toiletry items. Anything that has to do with your personal, I don't know the right word here, but you see what I'm saying, toiletries, getting your hair, and even like you said, if you choose to have a pet. Some people might put like the pet food under their grocery budget because it is food technically, but then you've got the maintenance and care that goes along with having a pet as well, right? Like vet bills. That could fall under personal. Now, the next one down is clothing. Now, this recommendation says, and this is the one that I struggle with, I don't know about y'all, but this recommendation says that you should not be spending more than 8% of your monthly budget on clothing. I have a hard time with that one. How about y'all? I love to shop. It's fun to go buy clothes, but you need to try to keep your clothing allowance at 8% of your total budget or less. And there are lots of ways that you can do that. I mean, you know, it's easy for guys. They have like 3 pairs of shoes, 5 pairs of jeans, and 6 shirts, and they're good to go, right? We can't do that. We've got to have numerous pairs of shoes. I'm guilty of that. Accessories that match every outfit, you know. I mean, there's just so many things that fall under the clothing budget for us. It's hard to manage, and it's hard to keep it at 8%, but there are a lot of ways that you can. How many of y'all buy clothing items when you first see them and they're not on sale? Anybody ever pay full price for clothing items just because you got to have it? I'm seeing people shake their head, no, that's good. Let me tell you why you should never ever spend your money on a full price item. You should always wait for it to go on sale or at least get some kind of sales coupon. Have y'all ever heard the term Keystone? Anybody studying marketing or merchandising? Keystone means basically they're marking it up 100%. Most clothing items are keystoned. In other words, if it hits the sales floor today and they've got it marked at regular price, $30, that means they paid $15 for it. They're just doubling the price. They're marking it up 100% of what they paid for it. That alone makes you not want to pay full price, right? Because you know they're making a 100% profit right there. But what about shoes? Do y'all know what the average markup is on shoes? 700%. That means that if you see a pair of shoes that at regular price are listed at $49, guess what they pay for those shoes? 700% markup. That makes you really not want to pay $49 for those shoes, right? If they paid $7 for them. This is why you should never pay full price for clothing, especially shoes. Wait till it goes on sale, get some kind of coupon, look for any way to save money. But I try my best not to ever pay full price for anything, especially clothes and shoes, because the markup is so high. So those are just some ways, you know, that you can work on keeping your clothing budget at around 8%. Now, this model recommends 7% of your budget going into your savings account. I like to say try to get it up to 10, but you can start with 7. Somebody tell me why you think it's important that when you're living on your own, that you have a savings account where you are contributing money to it on a regular basis. What's the purpose of having a savings account?
Is it for like emergencies?
It is, and there are different types of emergencies. In fact, I'm glad that you used that word, because there are savings accounts, and then there's also something called an emergency fund, and there's a difference between the two. Most of the time when you move out on your own, you're going to be working, right? Your savings account is where you regularly put the money. Anytime that you get paid, you need to contribute to your savings account, even if you have to start out really small. Go ahead and get in the habit of putting money in your savings so that you've got money put aside for those unexpected expenses, like your microwave dies or you have an unexpected car repair. And I can tell you that every car repair is always unexpected and it always happens at the worst time. We never can plan for those, like flat tires, things like that. But your emergency fund, on the other hand, is not just for unexpected expenses. Your emergency fund is a separate savings account where you need to have a goal of, at first, putting aside 3 months of living expenses. In other words, once you've got your budget built up, figure out how much it takes you to survive each month, pay your bills and eat and go to work and back. No extras, but just basically live. Multiply that times 3, and your goal initially is to have that much eventually put aside in your emergency fund. And then once you get to that goal, then start working towards 4 months, 5 months, with the eventual goal of having 6 months of living expenses. And it's going to take a while, but put aside. What do you think is the purpose of an emergency fund if your ultimate goal is to have 6 months of living expenses put aside?
In case you lose your job or like
Exactly.
something.
In case you lose your job. Because people, and as we well know in the last few months, a lot of people are out of work now that were not expected to lose their job at the beginning of the year. Nobody saw this coming. But people get laid off all the time, and very seldom are they expecting it or prepared for it. But if you have an emergency fund where you've got several months of living expenses put aside, then that gives you time to look for another job while you still have money to live on put aside. So you don't have to take the first job that comes along because you don't have any money put aside. So your ultimate goal with your emergency fund is to have eventually 6 months of living expenses put aside. And as I mentioned, it does take a while to get there, but you have to have your budget in place first so that you'll be able to determine what 1 month of living expenses actually is. Because when we're talking about basic living expenses, you know, you cut out your extras, but you have food, clothing, shelter, utilities, gas, what you need basically to survive, and figure that out from your budget. Okay, so you start out maybe 7% of your income every month going towards your savings with the goal of eventually putting 10% aside. And then the last 5% needs to go towards paying down any debt that you may have. And once you graduate, I know a lot of people will graduate with student loan debt. Does everybody understand the definition of debt? It's money debt's basically money that you borrowed and now you're paying it back. Why do you think it's so important to throw as much money as you can at your debt and get it paid off? Are you only paying back the amount that you borrowed?
No, interest adds up throughout the year.
Exactly. And for those of you that don't know, interest is the cost of borrowing money. In other words, it's the extra money that you pay back on top of the amount that you borrow. And it's usually in the form of a percentage of the amount that you borrow. So if you borrow, let's say you borrow $10,000 just for the sake of round numbers, and if you have a 5% interest rate, then you would, with simple interest, you would end up paying back 10,000 plus 5% of 10,000. And the longer it takes you to pay it back, the more interest you will end up paying back. So you need to, if you have any debt, as soon as you can, you need to be allocating 5% of your monthly budget towards paying down your debt so that you end up paying down the least amount of interest that you can. That makes sense? Okay, so this is a general overview of how you need to allocate your money for your budget when you first start looking at moving out. And it can be tweaked a little bit and it's an ongoing thing. Sometimes you might need to tweak it on the fly, but this is just a good broad overview, a good starting point for you. Now, in the next few slides, we're going to take a look at how you get to these ratios. Let's see, keep going if you would. All right, let's look at this. The biggest one of those spending ratios was your housing budget, right? Let's look at how you would come up with your housing spending ratio, how you're going to calculate that. So let's say that your rent is $750 a month, and we're going to talk about rent in just a minute. But let's just say it's $750 a month, and then you add a monthly amount of $15 for renter's insurance, and then let's say you have an additional $180 a month for your utilities, electricity, internet, if you have to pay for parking. That totals $945. All right, let's go to the next slide. Let's say that your monthly income, your net income, which is after taxes and deductions, which you actually bring home. Let's say you take home $3,200 a month after all your deductions. You would divide your total housing expenses, the $945, divide that by your total take-home pay, and that gives you the percentage that's your ratio. This one ends up being exactly 30%. Now, let's say that you take your total housing expenses divided by your take-home income for the month, and it ends up being more than 30%. What can you do to try to get it back down to 30%?
You can get a roommate.
Get a roommate, that's a biggie. Most of us started out with roommates. When I first graduated from college, there's no way I could have afforded to live by myself. I had to have a roommate. That's a really good way to bring down how much you're spending on your housing. You can look at, if you really fall in love with an apartment, you can look at maybe trying to cut back on some of your other categories for your budget. Maybe cut back on eating out, not spend as much money on food to try to help offset the cost of your housing expenses. But you really want to try to keep your housing budget at 30% of your monthly budget or less. Now let's take a second, and I'm skipping around on this, Stephanie, but let's talk about rent for a second. There is right here. Now, can everybody see this map right here? This is an average rent for a one-bedroom apartment across the United States. Now, the date on this was 2014. That was 6 years ago. I did a little bit of research earlier, and these numbers have gone up since 2014. For instance, in Macon, the average rent in Macon for a one-bedroom apartment is $858 a month. That's a lot. Augusta, $879, Columbus, $896. They're all right around mid to high 800s. But then let's look at Savannah. The average rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Savannah, Georgia is $1,098. Might as well say $1,100 a month. That's a pretty big chunk of change, isn't it? Just for rent. That's not everything else. That's just monthly rent. Guess what the average rent in Atlanta is right now for a one-bedroom apartment? Anybody have any idea? It's more than Savannah.
Ain't it like 3,000?
It's not quite that bad in Atlanta, but in Atlanta, it's just under $1,500 a month for a one-bedroom apartment. Now, keep in mind, these are averages, so there are some that are lower, some that are higher, but you don't want to live in an area where, you're paying a low amount of rent, but you sacrifice your safety or your well-being. You want to be comfortable where you live. It doesn't have to be luxury, but you at least want to be comfortable and feel secure. And ideally, try to live close to where you work. So maybe you're not spending as much on travel or gas. But let's look outside of Georgia. 6 years ago in 2014, the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan was $2,900. The average rent in Manhattan now for a one-bedroom apartment is $4,200. $4,200 a month for a one-bedroom apartment. Anybody have any idea why it's so high in New York?
Is it the like amount of people there that live there?
Yes, there are more people than there are places to live. It's all about supply and demand. The demand is much bigger than the supply, so they can pretty much charge whatever they want to. So it's the cost of living in New York is very, very high, but rental property is extremely high in New York City, especially in Manhattan. Let's look at some of the other cities across the United States. In LA, average rent for a one-bedroom apartment is a little over $2,500 a month. But now San Francisco in 2014, it was $1,900 according to this map. Today, average rent for a one-bedroom is $3,600 in San Francisco. That's almost as bad as Manhattan, not quite. Denver, Colorado, right now you're looking at just under $1,700 a month for a one-bedroom. Seattle, Washington, it's almost $2,200 a month. So housing is going to be your biggest monthly budgetary item. So before you start thinking about where you want to live, look into how much housing costs in those cities. Because I know when I was in college, I used to think I wanted to live in Colorado because it's beautiful in Colorado, but the cost of living is very, very high in Colorado. So housing.
I have a question. Oh,
yes.
Sorry. I've heard that Texas has pretty low, well, not renting like apartments, but housing. Is there a reason for that? Because I'm thinking like there's a lot of people in Texas since it's so big.
Well, there are a lot of people in Texas, but look at how much room there is in Texas too. You know, it's a big state all around. So, I don't know if that really has an effect on it, but I would think that it would because, like in New York City, you've got a large area, but you've got an even larger amount of people in that area. But then you go somewhere like Texas where, yeah, you get a lot of people, but you also have a big expanse in order to house those people. There's a lot more room there to build housing or rental apartments or anything like that. So I would think that that would have some effect on it.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. It's a great question. And y'all don't hesitate to ask any questions, okay? But I just want to give you kind of an updated numbers for your average housing because it has gone up pretty significantly since this was printed in 2014. So before you start thinking about, where you really want to live, do your research and find out how much it costs to live there because it may be more than you can afford to start with. Okay, so we can continue here. All right, so let's look at more than just the rent check. Let's take a look at your total housing costs because you're talking about when you first go to move out, you graduate and you want to get your first place. It's not just budgeting for your rent. You have one-time moving expenses. The first time you rent a place, and some of you may already be living in apartments, but when you first move into an apartment, usually they're going to ask you for the first and last month's rent up front. They want first month's rent and then they want last month's rent as a security deposit. So let's say you're paying $800 a month. That means you're going to have $1,600 up front to secure that apartment. And then there are moving expenses. Most of us have friends that we can ask to help us move, but not everybody, not all of our friends have trucks. You may have to rent a U-Haul truck. And I was looking earlier today to rent a moving truck. The cheapest rate I found for one day with a limitation of 30 miles, that's round trip, you're looking at just under $120 just for one day, round trip 30 miles. That's it, just for the truck rental. And that's the least expensive I found. And that's the smallest truck. So you've got moving expenses for your truck. You have to buy boxes now. Gone are the days when we could go back behind the grocery store and pick up, empty boxes. They don't do that anymore. They crush them. So you can't just get them for free. You have to buy them. And even at Walmart, you can buy them, but they're usually about $1.50 and above for each one. And that's just for a medium size. You may need some larger ones. You have to buy packing supplies like bubble wrap. You know, you need packing tape to seal up the boxes. So you've got the first and last month's rent, you've got packing materials, you have the moving expenses for actually renting a moving van, and then starter furniture. Now, your first apartment, your starter furniture, they call it starter furniture for a reason. This is not going to be the furniture that you end up with 5 years down the road. This is basic, get you started, get you out the door furniture. So used furniture is a great way to get started. Most of us, our parents will usually let us take our bedroom sit with us. That's kind of a given sometimes, but you've got to buy somewhere to sit to eat. So you need a table and a couple of chairs because you don't want to eat on the floor. You need somewhere to sit while you watch TV, and you need more than one chair to watch TV because what if you have friends over? You need to buy a TV if you don't already have one. You need basic furniture just to start with, but it can be good, sturdy, used furniture. It doesn't even have to match. You know, any of y'all ever go to the Salvation Army over on Mercy University Drive? They have lots of good, heavy wood used furniture, and they will negotiate with you all day long because they're trying to move it out. I bought lots of furniture there and refinished it. It's a great place to get really good prices on used wood furniture. But just remember, it is starter furniture. It doesn't have to match, doesn't even have to be all wood. It's what gets you started. It's not what you're going to end up with 5 years down the road when you want everything to look nice, okay? So you're going to have those one-time expenses that you have to save up for before you move, in addition to your monthly expenses that are going to come up every single month. Let's take a look at the next page. Now, these are your ongoing expenses. And the reason that we recommend creating a budget that's based on a month's paychecks or a month's income is because most of your bills will come due once a month. Pay them on a monthly basis. You've got your power, your electricity, your utilities like water, if you have cable or satellite or internet, renter's insurance. Does anybody know what renter's insurance is? Have y'all ever heard of that? Anybody? Well, y'all have heard of homeowner's insurance, right? Homeowner's insurance is for people who own their home, and you pay for homeowner's insurance so that if something happens to your house, if it burns down, a tree falls on it, you know, if you're broken into and people rob you, your insurance covers those expenses for repairing or rebuilding or replacing. But what if you don't own where you live? What if you rent? In that case, you can purchase renter's insurance, and I really, really recommend that you do. It's very affordable, very inexpensive, but whoever you rent from, they will have insurance that covers that building, okay? But what if that apartment catches on fire? Their insurance is going to cover the actual structure, but it doesn't cover your belongings. Renter's insurance covers your belongings when you rent a place. So let's say that let's say you're living in an apartment complex, like the last one I lived in, there were 4 along the first floor and then 4 apartments on the second floor. What if the person above you falls asleep smoking a cigarette and the whole place burns down? It's not your fault, but you lost most of your belongings. Well, the people that own the apartment complex have insurance for the building, but it's not going to replace everything you lost in that fire. It will not replace your belongings. Or what if the person above you leaves the water running in their tub and it runs down into your apartment and it shorts out your TV? Your renter's insurance will pay for your belongings. That's the sole purpose of renter's insurance, to pay for your belongings while you're renting, okay? And it's usually very affordable, maybe $15, $20 a month. So please look into purchasing renter's insurance because it will protect you while you rent. Sometimes you may have to pay for parking, and then there are those monthly household items. And this is not to be confused with groceries. These are just housing expenses that occur every month. Somebody give me an idea, and there's one on the picture right there of a monthly item that you need for your household. I mean, we've got toilet paper up there. What else?
Dishwashing liquid, washing powder,
Cleaning supplies.
toothpaste. Yeah.
Right. Cleaning supplies, anything that has to do with keeping your household going, right? You're gonna have to have that. Dishwashing. What if you don't have a washer and dryer in your apartment and you have to take your clothes to a washerette, or a lot of apartment complexes will have a building where they have washers and dryers, but you have to pay. You have to include the amount that you're gonna have to pay to use those washers and dryers in your household budget for your housing every month. You know, all your cleaning supplies, anything that has to do with keeping your household going. All those household items that you have to replenish on a regular basis. All that falls under your ongoing monthly expenses. And this all falls up under your housing budget, that 30%, okay? Okay, next one. So let's look at what you need to save up before you take this big final step. So you're gonna need first month's rent, and security deposits usually last month's rent. And if you can get a good apartment for $750 in a nice neighborhood, you're doing really well right now, but let's say that you do. A lot of apartment complexes, when you fill out the lease application, they will do a credit check on you. Why do you think an apartment complex or landlord might do a credit check on you before they allow you to sign a lease? They're not loaning you money.
To make sure you can pay your rent.
They want to make sure you can pay your rent every month. Exactly. And sometimes they may require that you pay for that background or credit check. You've got your moving costs, like we said, renting the truck, all your packing supplies, boxes, starter furniture, and then the miscellaneous items like we were talking about. And I had a list I was looking at earlier that I was making under miscellaneous. People tend to forget about utility deposits. When you first move out and you've got to set up those utility accounts like your Flint EMC account or your Georgia Power account, they charge you a deposit the first time because they don't know you. So the first time you start your account with them, you have to pay a deposit. The first time you start your utility for the city, wherever you live, if you have a water bill, trash pickup, they require a deposit the first time because they don't know you. So you've got your utility deposits, cleaning supplies. What about like curtains? What if your apartment doesn't have mini blinds? You need to be able to cover your windows, right, for privacy. What about things like a shower curtain? Or what about dishes? You've got to have something to eat off of, right? You've got to have dishes, you've got to have silverware, glasses, a few pots and pans. You know, all these fall under miscellaneous items that you're going to have when you move out to set up your home. And people tend to forget about a lot of things like that. Bath towels, you got to have towels, you got to have sheets, little kitchen gadgets. So think about all of those things that you'll need to set up where you live. Those fall under your miscellaneous one-time expenses to get you started. So basically, you're looking at saving up a little over $4,000 before you make that big move. That's a lot of money. It's more than just first and last month's rent. And it's usually surprising when people see how much they actually are going to need before they move out. But we're talking about it now so that y'all are not caught off guard. You've got this money put aside by the time you get ready to move out on your own. So you're prepared. All right. And this, like I said, is just kind of a broad overview so that you're not caught off guard and you are prepared. But y'all have any questions about any of the things we talked about as far as making your budget before you move, what's involved in creating a budget, ideas about sticking to a budget or ways you can save money when you move out? Any thoughts, questions at all? I'm always open for new ideas.
I have a question. So once you calculate your rent out of what you make monthly and it comes out to like 30 or whatever percentage,
right?
To start calculating the others, do you divide those by what you have left over or?
No, but that's a great question. For each category, you're going to take how much that total category is going to cost you for the month and divide it by your total take-home pay. And that gives you the percentage of your total take-home pay.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
That's a great question. And nobody's asked me that before. I'm glad you thought of that. Each one, you're going to take that budget total and divide it by your total take-home pay, your net pay. Everybody understands the difference between gross pay and net pay, right? Your gross pay is what you make. Your net pay is what you take home after they take out state and federal taxes, Social Security, any deductions that your employer takes out for things like medical insurance, 401k. Once they make all those deductions, what you actually bring home is your net pay, and that's what you use to budget, because that's what you've actually got left over to spend in your budget. Always budget for net pay, not gross pay.
I have a question.
Yes.
Would you use the same thought process when trying to buy a house?
As far as, yes, but I mean, as far as you definitely will need a budget to make sure that you are able to afford the house, yes. And the spending ratios, yes, you use the same process. And the housing part, it really should be about the same whether you're renting or owning. You shouldn't be spending more than 30% of your total take home on your housing, whether you own it or rent it. That's a good question. It's just that when you're looking at owning versus renting, buying versus renting, there are different expenses that go along with that. Instead of rent, you've got a house payment, and then you've also got things like homeowners insurance, which is a lot more than renter's insurance. And then you have to pay property taxes at the end of every year. So there are other expenses that go along with that. But yes, you would use the same basic process. That's such a good question. Anybody have any idea about when you do decide one day that you're tired of renting and you want to buy a place, how much you need to save up for a down payment? Because you cannot just finance 100% of a house when you go to buy a house.
20%.
I'm sorry, how much?
20%.
20% is the average. Yes, that's the starting point. Then there are a lot of programs out there that reduce that. In fact, there's most lending institutions like Robbins or like banks and other credit unions, most of us have a first-time home buyers program in place that brings it down to where you can save up, 3 to 5% instead of 20%, which makes your down payment a whole lot more affordable. So it's easier the first time, but usually you can only do that on the first time. It's for first-time home buyers, but it helps you take that step. It makes it easier when you get ready to buy that first time. And see, then when you get ready to buy a second time, you've got your current home that you can sell and, generate a larger down payment for the next one. It's just that first time that makes it kind of hard because you do have to save up down payment. Do y'all know the benefits of owning versus renting? Like I said, everybody starts out renting, but at some point you may want to own. Do you know what the benefits could be of owning a home?
Well, okay, I'm guessing, but like with renting, you have to pay every month. But when you buy a house and you finish paying it off, all you gotta do is just pay your utilities and stuff like that.
Yes, but how long do you think it takes to pay off a house?
A very long time.
Yes, most home loans are 30 years, 25 to 30 years. So even though you're not paying rent every month, you're making a house payment every month. That's called a mortgage loan. So you still have a monthly expense, but instead of the rent just going for the privilege of living there, every time you make a payment towards your house payment, you're buying a little bit more into the ownership of that home. You're paying down the loan that you took out to buy that home. And when you finish paying for it, yes, you will own it outright. But the other advantages are tax advantages. When you purchase a home, you borrow money, which is a mortgage loan, to buy that house. And when you pay it back, just like any other loan, you're paying interest. But when you have a mortgage, a home loan, you can write off a lot of your mortgage interest, the interest that you pay on that mortgage loan, to lower your tax liability. In other words, it's a deduction that you can take on your taxes every year. So it reduces the number of taxes that you're expected to pay every year, income tax. So there are definite tax advantages when you own a home versus renting. You can't write off rent on your taxes, but you can write off mortgage interest on your taxes. Of course, there are pros and cons on both sides as well. When you rent, you don't have to worry about cutting the grass. You don't have to worry about maintenance. If something breaks, you call your landlord, they come fix it. Whereas when you own your own home, all that falls on you. So, there's good and bad on both sides. And a lot of it depends on your circumstances. If you're working somewhere and you know that in a couple of years you might want to move to another city, then you're probably not going to want to buy, because if you're going to be gone in 2 or 3 years, you don't want to have to turn around and try to sell the house. So you might just rent for a couple of years. So rent versus buying really depends on your particular situation and circumstances at the time. There are definite advantages to both. Now, going back to when we were talking earlier about trying to reduce the cost of renting, somebody made the suggestion about getting a roommate. And I had a roommate for the first, let's see, I rented for 7 years when I graduated from college. And for the first 5, I had a roommate. And one suggestion that I would make, if you have a roommate, make sure that you balance out who's responsible for what monthly expenses. In other words, you both need to have some skin in the game. If one person is paying the rent and paying all the monthly expenses and the other person is just paying them back, then if that other person decides to just leave, they can just leave and you're left holding the bag for all those expenses without a roommate. But if you spread them out and balance them, like if you both pay the rent, but maybe one person pays the electric bill and one person is responsible for the water and trash pickup bill, and you spread it out, then you've got ownership responsibility from each person. So you're less likely for one of you to be left holding the bag with a lease that you can't afford because your roommate decided to just leave. So share the responsibilities of the bills if you have a roommate. Does that make sense? The last thing you want to do is to be left holding the bag for a lease for 2 people with a 2-bedroom apartment, and you can only afford to pay for half of it, but all of a sudden you don't have a roommate anymore and you can't afford the apartment. And then you're stuck with trying to find a roommate really, really quickly. And then then you don't get to pick and choose really who you want to be your roommate. It can be very stressful. But if you share those expenses, that's less likely to happen. And you can have 2 people's name on a lease, so you can share that rent responsibility as well. All right, great questions so far. Who else has thoughts or questions? Stephanie, you have any thoughts?
No, that was all really good information that hit a lot of
Great questions.
points, and and then branched off really nicely into some of those application pieces. Yeah, that sounds great. Oh, did I hear someone?
I know. Yeah, I have a
go ahead.
question. I know some places when you rent, like you were saying, like how you don't have to worry about cutting grass or stuff like that. I know some places depending if you're like renting a house or like a bigger spot, I guess, they still like make you have to keep up the maintenance around the house. So like, I don't know how that would affect like budgeting wise when you didn't expect that to be a part of your bills.
Yeah, well, and that's a good point, because especially like somewhere in Macon, if you rent maybe not an apartment in an apartment complex, but you're renting an apartment in an old historic house and there's a yard, then yes, they may expect you to keep up maybe with the grass cutting. But that's some of the things, those are some of the questions that you need to ask when you're talking to a potential landlord about, do you want to live there? Do you want to rent this place? You need to ask them up front what's included in that lease, because a lease is a contract. Now, it's a short-term contract. It may only be for 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, but it's still a contract and it's binding on both sides. And before you sign that lease, you need to read every word of it to make sure that there is nothing unexpected in there, like they expect you to keep the grass cut or do some sort of maintenance. You want to make sure that you read everything about that so you know what's expected of you as the lessee, as the person who's leasing that place. That's a great question. I know the last place that I rented was an actual small little house in Warner Robins, and it had a fenced in backyard. I had a little dog. And that's something else. If you have pets, you have to ask about pet deposits too. Make sure that they allow pets, and they will almost always, if they do allow them, require a pet deposit to pay for any damage your pet could do. But it had a fenced in backyard, and I was expected to keep the grass cut. But I worked out a plan with my landlord ahead of time. I said, you know, I don't own a mower because I've always lived in apartment complexes. So what if we add an additional $25 a month to the rent and you keep the grass cut? And he was good with that. So, but the main thing is you need to ask the questions and be aware so you're not hit with something unexpectedly after you sign the lease. Great question.
And another point I wanted to mention, this is Mallory, I wanted to mention because it was relevant for me with the credit check and the background check, that especially coming right out of college, you may still be trying to build up that credit where the apartment will approve. And so your first apartment, you may have to get someone to co-sign the lease with you to get through that first year lease, and then kind of once you build that rapport with them, it won't be necessary. But like I had to have a parent co-sign because I was still building up my credit at that point.
Right, exactly. That is a great point. And then, like you said, after that first lease is completed, then they know you and they won't need to do another one because you already have that relationship built up with them. They know you've been paying your rent on time, so you're all good. And it's usually that first time that you're moving into a place that they will do that. But yeah, because you know, when you turn 18 or when you graduate from college, even sometimes you don't have any credit. So you don't have a credit score for them to look at. Just like the first time you go to buy a car, a lot of times parents will have to co-sign with a child to buy that car because they don't have any credit established in their name. It's a good point. Credit's one of my favorite topics to talk about. We need to have a day to talk about credit scores.
I was going to say that was relevant for me. I couldn't buy my first car without someone helping me out because I didn't have credit built up, and so the banks kind of laughed at me.
Well, I mean, that's the biggest scenario when someone has a cosigner is usually someone's first car purchase. They don't have any credit, and the parent cosigns. But we can talk about cosigning on another day too, because that's usually the only time that you really need a cosign. Otherwise, you should never cosign with anybody.
And aren't there credit cards specifically for college students where you can get a low limit credit card and pay it off consistently to start building your credit during college instead of just using cash or a debit card?
Yes, because using cash or debit card does nothing to build your credit because it's not credit. I'm glad you brought that up. And most financial institutions have programs in place that are designed to help you build your credit. But as an example, I mean, I work at Robbins, so that's the one that I'm familiar with. But just as an example, at Robbins, we have a student visa that's designed to help you build your credit safely, the right way. But our requirements to have that is you're 18, you're working somewhere, even if it's part-time. If you can show us that you're 18 and have worked at the same place for the last 6 months, we will give you a student visa with a low interest rate and a $500 limit to help you start safely building your credit score. And all you have to do to build your credit is to make a small purchase with that credit card each month and then pay it back in full when the bill comes in each month. Make it a budgetary item that you know you're going to have the money to pay for. Pay it on time, and every on-time payment is the quickest way to build up your credit. I mean, you could, spend $10 a month going through the drive-thru, use that student visa. When your bill comes in, pay off that $10, and that carries as much weight building your credit as if it were a $50 or $100 purchase. It's the making the payment on time every month that builds up your credit. Good point. But most financial institutions have some sort of program in place that's designed to help you start building your credit safely. What you don't want to do is go out and get, a Best Buy Visa or Best Buy card and go to Penny's and get a Penny's or a Belt card and then go over here and get a card somewhere else at Academy Sports, because then you've got a lot of different credit cards, but they all have very high interest rates. Most retail store cards carry an interest rate of 25 to 35%. Whereas most visas, especially with credit unions, because we're nonprofit, the highest interest rate we have on anything, whether it's a card or a loan, is 18%, period. And that's the very highest. Right now, you could get a student visa with a 10% interest rate. And most, you don't really need those retail store cards if you have a Visa, MasterCard, Discover, and American Express, because all those retail stores take Visa, MasterCard, Discover, and American Express. So you don't need all those retail store cards. That's how people get into trouble.
Well, sounds like in the spring, we'll do a program on credit.
That sounds great. I love to talk about credit.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, we're about at our hour mark. So I want to thank Donna and everyone for attending. I loved having you here. Love talking about these topics. So I'll be on for a few more minutes if anyone has questions, but I will stop our recording officially, and thank you all so much. Appreciate it. Have a great
Yes, thank y'all for having me again. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.